Well, the O.J. Simpson case, probably as much as any in recent memory, captured the entire attention of a nation. And it was this scene, in fact, that we have an anniversary of sorts. This week was 20 years since we saw this. And if you're watching the Knicks in the NFL Finals, NBA Finals at the time, right, you remember all of a sudden the double box that came up. Well, you got O.J. Simpson skipping his court appearance in the double murder case, of course, involving ex-wife Nicole Brown Simpson. And he headed off on the LA freeway in a white Bronco. Many people may not remember, it wasn't going more than 20 miles an hour. And who was with him in the car?
Al Cowlings.
Al Cowlings, yeah, that's right. And the slow speed chase, as I said, interrupted NBA Finals here. Everybody remembers where they were, and you know why? Because it had a bigger audience than the Super Bowl of that same year. Think about that. O.J., of course, finally surrendered and had America's attention for nearly a year as his trial played out like a real-life soap opera on network TV. Many would say that this case, in fact, changed the country's opinion of where the justice system and the issue of race in the justice system really was at that point. If we remember when the verdict was read here, the reactions in different parts and maybe even in the same room by different folks here. All right, I want to bring in our legal panel. And tonight we're joined by Jimmy Koussouras, criminal defense attorney in Manhattan, lecturing at New York Law School, visiting professor at the University of Birmingham in England, and Doug Von Oist. Doug's the founding partner of Carson Von Oist, focusing on corporate misconduct, and was selected by the Legal 500 as one of the most influential trial lawyers in the nation. And Mayo Bartlett, attorney and former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County DA's office. And Rach will be a part of this conversation. You've been involved in a couple high-profile cases yourself here. But let's first start off about how the case, from an optic view, changed at least perceptions of the public with the law. And I think it starts off with cameras. The thing started with cameras with the Bronco chase. And it was played out, and people may not want to admit it in polite company, but people thought they were going to see a suicide on live TV.
Absolutely.
Then all of a sudden, you have the visuals of telegenic families that were involved in this. America's superstar. O.J., people forget, was a beloved figure. NFL Hall of Famer. He was the Hertz guy, right? He was in a Naked Gun. And then we'll get into all the sidebars. But the cameras in the courtroom, Jimmy, it was the first, I think, reality TV for a lot of the public here. And I don't know if it's just the public, but a lot of the folks that weren't used to having cameras in the courtroom, all of a sudden that became as important as the judge.
And it was probably the worst introduction to cameras in the courtroom than you could ever imagine. It was the absolute worst case for there to be cameras in the courtroom.
Why do you say that?
Well, because it really did become a reality TV show. You had a judge, you had lawyers. Everybody in there was more concerned with their own celebrity and advancing it than the actual trial. This was a 2-month murder trial that turned into an 11-month fiasco. The thing that moved me the most was the DNA expert for the people. I'll never forget it. His testimony was over. He got off the stand in front of the jury and shook the hands of the entire defense team. It was bizarre. There was more talk about Marcia Clark's new hairdo and whether she went to some hotel with Chris Darden than there was about the case. It was a farce. It was a farce, and it was the worst case to put cameras in the courtroom for. It just really was.
Doug, from the optics, you former prosecutor here, nobody remembers who the prosecutors are. Nobody remembers who the judge. You say the judge to this day, I bet you half the American public can still say Judge Ito.
The
right?
Ito effect.
Right. I mean, they remembered even the forensic experts. They remembered, I mean, and then all the sidebar characters, the Cato Kalins, the house guests, you could go through every member of the family tree on the Brown family, et cetera, here, and the Goldmans. I mean, talk about just from you're a young attorney at the time here, right? When you saw this, did this say, wow, this is, I'd love to be part of this profession, or were you thinking, I better get back into wrestling?
No, I think everybody, listen, this was like, everybody was fascinated with this. And I think everybody kind of remembers their first time. And I think that this case, if cases were like this, and I mean, big cases were covered constantly, people would kind of get used to big cases being covered. But this was really the first time, and you had everything here. You had, you had California, you had L.A., you had people forget how big O.J. Simpson was. He was a big deal.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it was-
Monday Night Football.
It was a perfect storm.
I'm curious, Mayo, in the years that followed, when you're going through jury selection and you're crafting what your opening statements are going to be, both when as a prosecutor and then later as a defense attorney, was there almost an expectation of the jury that, hey, I want to show like OJ here. I want to get the sizzle. I don't want to just have the vegetables. I want some dessert here with this trial.
Well, following this case, a lot of the TV law shows started to come around, and so now what I found was people would always say, who watches Law and Order, who watches CSI, this case is not going to be like that. But what I found also is that the prosecution started to try to lower the expectations in terms of what the jury's going to expect. That DNA, you can't always get DNA, it's hard to get a fingerprint, all of that kind of stuff. This case, I think, really, it did a tremendous disservice. The fact that the cameras were in the courtroom, it really added a Hollywood element, and it took a case that was surreal, and it gave people the impression that that's how court was, when court couldn't be anything further from the truth. And when you really look at it again, this case would never have taken nearly a year to try if it was anywhere else. You had evidence that was pretty straightforward, but the evidence scene was not controlled. So that evidence scene was, people were all over the place on that evidence scene. The crime scene was not secured. It was almost like it was reality TV, and when the crime scene's not secured, you have issues of contamination,
And
of
then
evidence.
don't forget Mark Furman, right? You have one of the officers on the scene, the investigator, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, they got audio recordings of him dropping the N-bomb, right?
I had never heard the word referred to as the N-word before Chris Darden. And the minute Chris Darden got up and they showed his opening statement when they were talking to the jurors, he says, "Some of you are going to hear this word. It's the N-word." I said, "What word is that?" I had no idea what he's talking about. And he started to try to downplay this. And then eventually, they knew that Furman was going to perjure himself.
Amazing.
They knew this. You talk about suborning perjury. He was going to come in and say he never used that word. Well, that really was kind of academic, whether you ever used that word, but the fact that you're willing to lie about that.
Yeah.
And then there's actually an instruction that the judge will give the jury that if you find a person lies with respect to one thing that's material, you can exclude some or all of that person's testimony in your mind. So you don't have to give that person any credibility.
So you guys all think that this was, I want to get this more in the next one, but an indictment of the judicial system?
It was a poorly tried case, and it was a case in which this judge had absolutely no control over the characters and allowed it to turn into an LA Hollywood media circus. It didn't need to be.
Yep.
It didn't need to be. He could have controlled the courtroom. The trial could have been done in 2 months. It was a poorly tried case, in my view, from the
But
prosecution
you know what this
standpoint.
case was also? It was an example of if you give a defendant a lot of money, he can make issues. And most times when a guy doesn't have money to spend and spread around on experts, he can't do that stuff.
Did you guys
People didn't
ever,
like it, but
did any of you ever have even the slightest temptation to try and have somebody put a glove on after this trial?
Well, that's what I mean when it's poorly tried. How can you possibly tell the man to get up and try? That glove wasn't going to fit if it was born on his hand. I mean,
Yeah,
what are
But
you
if we look
doing?
at what Doug said, I think the bigger issue is all the people who don't have money.
Yeah.
And
That's
all the
right.
issues.
That's
Because,
right.
see, you don't create issues. Issues exist. Either you can identify them or you don't. But when you don't have the resources, you can have a great attorney. If they don't have any resources, no investigator, all those issues don't come to light. And you get a lot of people who maybe shouldn't be convicted who can be convicted.
All right, stay with me, guys. When we come back, I want to talk 20 years later about the implications of this trial and how it helped make people's careers, destroyed some others, but also changed the way I think that the public here looked at the law for good or for bad. Stay with us.